we were discussing Giotto, and this painting from the National Gallery that he made for the Franciscan Church in his home city of Florence, which is where he stayed for most of his career. That was his home base. That said, his innovative and modern style led to a certain amount of fame in the 14th century, and this allowed him to work all over Italy. Even though he remained based in Florence, he worked in almost every other city in Italy during the 14th century. His most important commission was in the North Italian city of Padua, just outside of Venice, and you see it here circled in blue. And this was to decorate the interior of a chapel that had been built on the site of an old Roman arena, and thus it's called the Arena Chapel. Here we see the chapel from the outside. It seems to have been purpose-built for Giotto's decoration. If you look at the interior, you can see that one wall is entirely without windows, one big blank surface, where the other wall is, in fact, permeated with windows that illuminates the opposite wall. This has suggested to some people that maybe Giotto himself designed the building in tandem with the paintings that he was designing for the interior. Now, this chapel was the private family chapel of a man named Enrico Scrovegni, whose name you see here. We're looking back toward the door in the slide on the right. Scrovegni donated the money for the chapel in order to help forgive his family's sins. This was quite the norm. His family was quite famous, as a matter of fact. His father appears in Dante's Inferno in hell. His father was a money lender, which was a grave sin in the Middle Ages, to lend money for a profit, ask for interest on a loan. It was called usury in the Middle Ages, and was really a very, very grave sin. I guess you could tell that to your student loan officer next time you see him. But what we're looking at here, as we look back toward the door on the right, just here, sorry about that, is the Last Judgment. And Enrico Scrovegni actually appears in the Last Judgment, right at the foot of the cross, below Christ. And he's offering up our chapel, the Arena Chapel, to angels who receive it. It's actually saints who receive it, in order to expiate his father's sins, to gain forgiveness for his family and his forefathers. Inside the chapel, there is a series of 38 different images. And as you can see looking, they take up three basic tiers or sections at the very top, in the middle, and down below. Down below that, at sort of ground level, the things that look like marble are also painted. This is marbleized rather than real marble. Everything inside is frescoed. Each of the three tiers gives us a different theme, all centering on Christ and the Virgin Mary. At the very, very top is the life of the Virgin Mary, and then we work our way down from there as we go through her life and Christ's life. In the center is the infancy of Christ, his birth, his youth, as well as his adult life. And then at the bottom is Christ's passion, which is his torture, and his death. And so they sort of read in a circle. You go down the left wall, back up the right wall, down the left wall, back up the right wall, on each of the three tiers. Now, if you want to learn more about the life of Christ in art, you can follow this link. Go to the PowerPoint that's on Canvas, and click on this link to the NNA timeline, where you can read about the different scenes that often appear in art with the life of Christ. With this screen class, what we'll do is focus on one of the scenes. I highlighted it in the slide on the left, and you can see it on the right here, the Lamentation. This is one of the scenes from the Passion and Death of Christ. This is the moment after he dies. And we'll talk a bit more about the subject matter in just a second, but I wanted to talk about the painting technique, the medium of the work. This is painted in what's called fresco. This is the Italian word, fresco, is the Italian word for fresh. And the technique is to apply plaster to the wall, and while the plaster is still wet, you paint it with watercolors. And so if you look in the Lamentation scene, you can see sort of a day's work in the cracks that you see there. My pen isn't working. But you can see the different cracks, the large sections where Giotto has laid down wet plaster, and in each of these sections he considers it to be sort of what he can get through in one day. Because if the plaster dries, you got to chip it off and start all over again. So the fresco artists were very careful. You need to have the plaster wet. And that's what fresco means. It's painting into wet, into fresh plaster. Now the subject matter, the iconography, as we talked about in class. This is the moment just after Christ has been crucified. And he's been taken down from the cross. And his followers are given a moment to mourn his death. Now this is not a scene that appears anywhere in the Bible, this actual description of this moment. But it has become a very common scene in religious painting throughout the Middle Ages. Right? So Christ's followers at this point don't know that he's going to be resurrected, that he will live after death. At this moment, they simply see his lifeless body and are struck with grief. Now, what we're looking at in the two scenes, right, in the crucifixion on the left, we see obviously Christ on the cross, the angels mourning as they continue to do in the Lamentation. So these are side-by-side scenes in the Armenian chapel. But in the crucifixion scene, to the left of Christ, you see the Virgin Mary, and she is fainted. She's wearing blue, and she's held up by two of her followers, one of whom, the man in red, is St. John the Evangelist, the one who wrote the Gospel of St. John. They most often appear at the foot of the cross, and Mary, overcome by grief, has fainted. The other woman at the foot of the cross is Mary Magdalene, another of Christ's followers, and she grieves more openly. She reaches out to touch the wounds at his feet, kneels down at the foot of the cross. All of these characters repeat in the Lamentation scene on the right. The Virgin Mary is now holding Christ by his head. Mary Magdalene is still at the feet of Christ, and John the Evangelist has his hands thrown back behind him, pretty much in the center of the composition. We'll look at these in detail, and one of the things I want to focus on is the degree to which Giotto is most interested in the human suffering of these actors in his play. Every one of them, he's focusing on how Christ's death has affected them in an individual way. And if you look at the range of characters that we have, you'll notice that we have everything from sort of quiet dignity on your right to more open wailing and crying. And the Magdalene here holds his feet again, just as she had held them at the foot of the cross a minute ago. That's the image immediately to the left. These little connections are things that Giotto loves to do to sort of push you through the narrative. There's a close-up of Mary Magdalene, and you can see that even if you look closely at her eyes, the red along the bridge of her nose, because she's been crying, and her face is distorted from pain and suffering as she's lamenting the passing of Christ. The Virgin Mary as well, her face is utterly racked with pain. A really sort of subtle three-quarter view here as well, but her cheeks pulled back. Again, her eyes reddened from crying as she looks into the lifeless eyes of her only son, or at least her only son insofar as Catholic theology is concerned. This is, in fact, Giotto's great strength, the ability to bring human emotions into his religious pictures. In fact, he draws on numerous biblical and extra-biblical texts, non-biblical texts, to elaborate on his themes. And in fact, one of these religious tracts talked about the fact that when the Virgin Mary held the dead Christ in her hands, she remembered holding him as a child. And Giotto, I think, knows that text because if you look back at the nativity scene on the left here, where the Virgin Mary takes Christ from one of the handmaidens to hold him, you can see that what Giotto has done with the two of them is put the Virgin Mary in a very, very similar position in these two very widely separated images to give you this idea that, what she once held as a child, a youth full of hope and with the future is now dead. And if we look at the Virgin Mary in the two of these, we can see how he's really playing with that idea. She makes direct eye contact with her son on his left, her face again beautiful because she's not grieving, she's happy this time. Whereas now we have the dead body of Christ limp in her arms. Now to wrap this up and to drive home the point of Giotto's humanism, the degree to which he brings humanity to his works, we should look back at an early Byzantine example, a slightly earlier, only about 150 years before. Byzantine example is exactly the same scene, and you can see here that a lot of the overall composition comes out of tradition. We have Mary holding the head of Christ, we have figures grabbing his hands to kiss them, kneeling down at the feet, the angels up above mourning the passing of Christ, the rocks in the background sort of forming a simple backdrop to this scene. A lot of that is repeated by Giotto. But Giotto does a lot more than that. He doesn't pose the figures so obviously. Some of them turn their backs to us, for example. They're not there simply to look at us. Some of them block our view of the body of Christ. You don't see any of that in the Byzantine work. It's much more staged. It's much more posed. Giotto's is much more natural. And with that naturalism comes his use of what we call in class his chiaroscuro, his use of light and dark to model the figures in a very strong, give them a very strong three-dimensional quality. This use of light and dark, this chiaroscuro, comes from Giotto's looking back at ancient Roman art. Now, he didn't know this exact work. Pompeii was covered in ashes. It wasn't excavated until the 19th century, maybe the 18th century. And so he would not have known this, but he would have seen other examples of Roman painting, Roman mosaics, where you could see that same modeling of the figure in three dimensions through a fall of light and dark that we call chiaroscuro. Giotto is picking this up from Roman art. And this is part of the reason they call this the Renaissance. The Renaissance means rebirth. What is reborn? The ideals of ancient Rome. And for art, that means this three-dimensional, lifelike quality. Now, when Giotto is looking back at ancient Roman art, he's not looking at the figure types per se. His bodies don't look like Roman athletes. And he's not looking back at the subject matter either. He's not doing images of Roman gods. But what he is getting from them is this interest in realism, achieved through use of chiaroscuro. So this is a very important part of this early Renaissance. It's this interest in naturalism and realism that comes from studying Roman art. Finally, if you want to know more about the Arena Chapel, Smart History has a series of videos that explain it in greater detail, so you can find out more about some of the other frescoes in the chapel. It's not just one. In fact, there are 4 parts to this. And as you can see, if you play all 4 parts, it's about 25 minutes long, all told, of different videos that explain different parts of this. So if you're interested, download the PowerPoints from Kansas and click on each of these that present you a link to the Smart History site